Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And it's the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And once again, we're talking about Conan. Because Cimmerian September just ended. And in Cimmerian September, I read every single Conan story written by Robert E. Howard, and so did a few others. And some are still reading Conan, which is fine. It's always a good time to read Conan. So Conan. I read all the Conan stories in the 3-volume Del Rey set. I already talked about the first volume, which was The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. I made a video about that. I'll link it down below in case you missed it. And today I'm going to be talking about the second volume, which is this one. This is The Bloody Crown of Conan. And this volume has 3 Conan stories in it. And one of the Conan stories in this volume is the only full-length novel that Robert E. Howard ever wrote about Conan, The Hour of the Dragon, which is my personal favorite. It's my favorite Conan story. This is a great set of books, the Del Rey set. I think it is the best edition of Conan out there right now. It probably will remain so for a while. Just a great set of books. And I was really happy to get this one because, like I said, The Hour of the Dragon has always been a favorite of mine. It was reprinted in L. Sprague de Camp's set as Conan the Conqueror. He retitled the story, as well as making some edits and changes. But this has the original version as Robert E. Howard wrote the story. And it's fantastic. I should mention, all 3 of these volumes from Del Rey are illustrated, but they all have different illustrators. And the illustrator of this volume is Gary Gianni, and he does a really interesting job illustrating Conan. He has his own style, and a very different style to what we saw in the first volume and from what we'll see in the third volume. So it's interesting, but it's fantastic. It's really cool. This is a great volume to have. Just for the artwork alone, these Del Rey editions are wonderful. As well as how faithfully they reproduce the text. And so the first story in this volume is The People of the Black Circle. I'm pretty sure that's the first story, but let me check and make sure I'm not wrong. It's The People of the Black Circle, which was a really good Conan story. It's a longer Conan story. I won't give away too much of the plot. Basically, it takes place in the Hyborian Ages version of India. The city's name, where this story... Well, it's Vendia. And the king of Vendia at the beginning of this story is dying. And the king is being killed slowly from afar by sorcerers. And eventually the king does die, and his sister vows vengeance. His sister needs to find a way to get revenge on these sorcerers. Eventually, after a lot of different things happen, she ends up with Conan. Conan, a bandit leader. And she wants to get Conan to help her destroy these sorcerers. He's the only guy around who seems fearless enough to do it. She ends up being kidnapped, though, by these sorcerers, the people of the Black Circle, and Conan goes after her. And it's just an excellent adventure. That's my very thin synopsis of the plot. There's a lot of cool stuff in this story. Conan is just Conan at his best. Full of adventure. Giant snake. Conan fights a giant snake. You know, if you've got a giant snake or a giant ape in the story, you know, that always raises it up a level. But I think People of the Black Circle, it's considered one of the best Conan stories. And after reading it again, I think, yeah, it is one of the best Conan stories. It's fantastic. Fast-moving, adventurous pulp story. Just what you want from Conan. And then that story is followed up by The Hour of the Dragon, which is a really interesting Conan story. So The Hour of the Dragon has an interesting backstory to it. So there was an English publisher who expressed interest in Robert E. Howard's writings. Now, Robert E. Howard had never had a book published of his stories. He was published published all of his stuff in pulp magazines, mostly weird tales. But there was this interest expressed in his stories, so he sent a collection of stories to this English publisher. They held on to it forever, and he didn't hear back from them. And finally he did, and it was a rejection. They said, well, you know, our public right now, as good as this stuff is, they're not really interested in short stories. There, even back then, was a prejudice against short stories in books. But the publisher said, you know what, if you could write something like this that was a novel, you know, we'd be really interested in looking at that. So Robert E. Howard's like, okay, I'll do that. And he spent, I think it was 2.5 months writing The Hour of the Dragon, his first Conan novel. It's interesting because it had been a while since Robert E. Howard had written a story where Conan was a king. The first Conan story was a story, The Phoenix on the Sword, where Conan was a king. And then he, shortly after that, he wrote The Scarlet Citadel. Another great story where Conan was already king of Aquilonia towards the end of his career. But The Hour of the Dragon is a story where Conan is a king. And he nearly loses his kingdom. There are some conspirators who want to bring Conan down. They resurrect with the help of, there's a sorcerer in the conspiracy. And they resurrect this ancient, super powerful sorcerer from the distant past to use this sorcerer to bring down Conan, which through sorcery at this battle at the beginning of the story, they managed to do. This sorcerer, though, has ideas of his own. He's super powerful, and he wants to keep Conan alive as kind of a check on these other guys. One of the conspirators is going to be a puppet king of Aquilonia. He's related to the previous line of kings, and so he is put on the throne as kind of a puppet. He has no real power. And Conan is thrown in a dungeon, which he has to escape from, which he promptly does with some help of a beautiful young woman who falls in love with Conan immediately because, you know, that tends to happen. And Conan has to go on a quest to find this magic jewel which can be used to bring down this wizard. As it turns out, this wizard is the main threat. This wizard takes control of everything. And if he brings down this wizard, he can get his kingdom back. Because this guy who's on the throne now is just terrible and hanging people and taxing everybody and just being all around awful. Where Conan, he was a really good king who cared about his subjects. So it ends up being this very episodic quest story, full of dangers and supernatural threats, and a giant ape shows up, so you know that raises the story up. It's wonderful. It's a great fantasy novel, great pulp fantasy novel, and a lot of fun. There are some things about it that are interesting. So Conan had to write this very fast. And he did a bit of cannibalizing, which is a term that Raymond Chandler came up with, I believe. Raymond Chandler was also a pulp writer. And when he wrote his novels, sometimes what he would do is he would go back to some ideas that he had in his earlier shorter stories, which he figured his audience, the audience of his books, would never read or even see because they were just published in Black Mask. He would go back and take some plot ideas, whole scenes or whatever, and he would put them in his novels. And Robert E. Howard kind of did that in this instance. So if you read his stories in the order of Conan's life, as opposed to the order in which they were written, there are things that seem very familiar, because he takes some plot ideas from The Phoenix on the Sword, and mostly from The Scarlet Citadel, which he figured, this British audience that he was writing this novel for, they would never see these stories, so why not use these plot ideas? Because remember, he had to get this book out there fast, right? He wrote it in a couple of months. So it's not, he doesn't take any prose or anything like that, but he does take some basic plot ideas from these earlier stories, and he uses them in The Hour of the Dragon. That's pretty apparent when you read it. And some people who read this for Cimmerian September noticed that, because it's very noticeable. But forgivable, I think, because like I said, Robert E. Howard had no idea that anybody who read this novel in Britain would ever have read those earlier stories. It was unlikely. And he certainly had no idea that the Conan stories would ever be collected. I mean, he was writing for the pulps, and the best chance he actually had at being remembered at all for a writer, he figured, was if this novel was published in Britain. And then perhaps he could write a series of novels. Oh, sorry, it's breakfast time for the corgi. Always kind of Harriet to let me know when it's time for her breakfast. Anyway, Robert E. Howard must have foreseen the possibility of, a series of novels that he could write about Conan. Unfortunately, The Hour of the Dragon ended up being rejected. As it turns out, I think the publisher went out of business, actually. And so the novel was never published, unfortunately, as a novel, as a book in Britain. And so it ended up being published as a serial in Weird Tales. So it was published in Weird Tales and was very popular. And it was a novel that Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, liked an awful lot. He should have, because it was really good. But that does explain how familiar certain elements of the novel are. But it's such a good story. It's such a great story, and it was so fun to read it again, because Robert E. Howard packs so many Conan things into the story. It has more of a feel of the Middle Ages than a lot of the previous Conan stories did. A lot of the previous Conan stories felt very ancient, whereas this felt more like, it almost felt like a story of King Arthur, where you had this king who was on a quest, and how the kingdom just went to hell as when the king was separated from his kingdom, the kingdom went to hell. But once he returned, all things flourished again in Aquilonia. Great story. Now this collection finishes up with the story "A Witch Shall Be Born," which is, can I find the beginning of the story? Yeah, "A Witch Shall Be Born," which has this cool illustration in the beginning, which kind of shows you what's going on in this story, which is where a witch shows up who happens to be the twin sister of a queen who was abandoned early because she had a mark of she had a mark which showed that she was going to grow up to be a witch. There was every few generations in this family a witch shall be born, and a witch has been born. And she takes control of this city-state. And Conan, who happens to be working as a mercenary captain in this city, he ends up being crucified. Conan is crucified. And that is the thing everybody remembers from this story. Conan's crucifixion, which is illustrated right here by Gary Gianni. He's crucified. A vulture comes down to eat him, but he breaks the vulture's neck with his teeth because that's how tough Conan is. And that was... Otherwise, A Witch Shall Be Born, the last story in this volume, is not particularly great. It's okay. It feels like an okay Conan story. Robert E. Howard was, at this point, starting to experiment a little bit in his Conan stories, and his experiments produced two of the greatest Conan stories, which appear in the next volume. But this one, despite moments of greatness, wasn't a particularly great story, I feel like. Although there are certain scenes and certain things about it that are awesome. Conan isn't in the story all that much. The story actually, for a lot of it, follows other characters. But Conan still, despite not being in the story, dominates the whole thing. And he ends up surviving this crucifixion, which is rather unlikely, but he does, because he's Conan. You know, if anybody can, it's Conan. And he ends up taking charge of a group of bandits. And he ends up helping to take back this kingdom from this witch. It's interesting. Well worth reading. I think it's probably, as far as Conan stories, it's in the middle somewhere. If you were to, rank these by greatness, it was probably in the middle somewhere. But some of those moments are so memorable, and particularly that crucifixion scene. That was something else. It's funny. One of the most memorable scenes in all of Conan ends up in this story, which in itself is not particularly memorable. But certainly the volume is worth it for the Hour of the Dragon alone. Every Conan story is worth reading. There aren't any really bad ones. And this has two of the best, and one that is, okay. The next volume, the Conquering Sword of Conan, which I will do a video on soon, has two of the greatest stories ever written about Conan. It has probably the greatest Conan story in it. It's not my favorite. Hour of the Dragon is my favorite, but the next volume I'll be talking about probably has the greatest Conan story in it. So that'll be fun. So that's all I have to say about The Bloody Crown of Conan. You should definitely read it. It's awesome. I will catch you next time.